The streets of Atlanta were alive with the hum of a Friday night. Neon lights flickered against the glass buildings, and distant laughter mixed with the honking of impatient drivers. Detective Marcus Hale wasn't interested in the nightlife. He had one goal tonight: to get home after an exhausting shift. His unmarked sedan cruised through downtown, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as he exhaled slowly. It had been a long week of dead-end leads and bureaucratic headaches. The last thing he wanted was more trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him. As he approached a red light, a flash of movement caught his attention. A silver SUV blew past the intersection, tires screeching. Seconds later, the blare of sirens followed. 2 squad cars tore after it, lights flashing. Marcus sighed. Another chase. Then he saw it. The SUV was headed straight for a crowded pedestrian crossing. Without thinking, Marcus slammed his foot on the gas, cutting through an empty lane and veering onto a side street to get ahead. He yanked his wheel, positioning himself between the SUV and the crosswalk. The vehicle screeched to a halt inches from his bumper. Marcus stepped out, badge in one hand, the other resting near his holster. The officers pursuing the SUV skidded to a stop behind him. Weapons already drawn. Hands where we can see them, one of the uniformed officers shouted. The driver hesitated before slowly stepping out. He was young, couldn't be more than 20, with wide, terrified eyes. I didn't steal the car," he stammered. "It's my brother's." Marcus frowned. "Then why run?" "Because I was scared," the kid admitted. "I just turned 18. I thought they'd arrest me for no reason." The officers behind Marcus weren't convinced. One reached for his cuffs. Marcus lifted a hand. "Hold on." He turned back to the young man. "You got proof this is your brother's car?" The kid nodded quickly, pulling out his phone with shaking fingers. Moments later, Marcus was staring at a string of frantic texts from an older brother confirming everything. Marcus glanced at the officers. "Let's confirm it, but looks like we're not dealing with a car thief tonight." The officers hesitated before lowering their weapons. For the first time that night, the kid's shoulders loosened. Marcus had seen this moment before, the thin line between justice and assumption. And tonight, he chose to make sure they got it right. The warm air of Houston's evening wrapped around the quiet street as Daniel Carter stepped out of his car. His every movement deliberate. The flashing red and blue lights behind him cast shadows across the pavement. He had been driving home from dinner, enjoying the rare moment of peace after a long week. But now, that peace had been interrupted. Officer Wade Jensen, early 40s, with sharp eyes and an unshakable confidence, approached the car, his hand resting near his holster. Something about Daniel's calm demeanor unsettled him. Most people fumbled with their words, rushed to explain themselves. But Daniel? He was too composed. "You seem pretty sure of yourself," Jensen muttered, "like you think you know how this is gonna go." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "It's not about confidence, officer. It's about respect." Jensen's jaw tightened. He tapped his fingers against his belt before stepping back. "Turn around. Hands on the hood." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Are you searching me for weapons?" "Standard procedure," Jensen said. "Don't make this difficult." For a moment, Daniel just looked at him, something unreadable in his expression. Then, without protest, he turned and placed his hands flat against the hood. Jensen's pat-down was rough, more about dominance than necessity. But Daniel didn't react. "You're clean," Jensen muttered. "Of course I am," Daniel said, straightening. "Now, officer, if we're done." "We're not," Jensen cut in. Daniel exhaled, his posture still relaxed. "I've had my fair share of these interactions," he said, "and I've learned a lot from them." Jensen narrowed his eyes. "That so? You a lawyer or something?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Or something." Jensen frowned at the ambiguity. But before he could press further, Daniel reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately. "I'm grabbing my badge," he said. "No need for theatrics." A moment later, he flipped open a leather wallet, revealing a gleaming badge. "Daniel Carter," he said, "Federal Internal Affairs." Jensen's face paled. The balance of power had just shifted. And for him, this was only the beginning. The streets of Savannah were quiet under the warm glow of the streetlights. Malcolm Hayes kept his hands relaxed on the steering wheel, exhaling slowly as the red and blue lights flashed behind him. He had been driving home after a long evening at his office, the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders. Officer Grant Holloway approached the car. His stance rigid, eyes sharp. He was in his early 40s. His uniform crisp, but there was something in the way he moved, a practiced authority that carried more than just routine protocol. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Holloway asked. His voice clipped. "Just going home," Malcolm replied evenly. His tone was composed, but he could already sense it. This was more than a traffic stop. Holloway lingered, folding Malcolm's documents slowly before tucking them into his pocket. His expression hardened, his stance widening. "Step out of the vehicle for me." Malcolm's fingers flexed briefly against the wheel before he let go. "May I ask why, officer?" Holloway tilted his head slightly, a hint of a smirk ghosting over his lips. "I asked you to step out of the car. Let's not make this complicated." The implication was clear. Malcolm took a breath, then pushed open the door, stepping out onto the pavement. He was taller than Holloway. His frame lean but composed. His tailored blazer spoke of professionalism, his polished shoes of careful intent. Yet none of that seemed to matter. "Hands where I can see them," Holloway said, voice firm. Malcolm complied, his movements precise. "Would you mind telling me what exactly you're looking for?" Holloway's smirk deepened. "Just routine. Had some incidents in the area. Gotta stay alert." Malcolm met his gaze. "Steady. Incidents involving professionals in suits driving through well-lit streets? Or is there something else at play here?" For the first time, Holloway hesitated. "Just for a second. You seem real familiar with how this works." Holloway muttered. "Got something to hide?" Malcolm let the silence linger before responding. "No, officer. I just believe in clarity. Transparency. You know?" The moment stretched between them, the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. The setting sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Charleston, South Carolina. Thomas Gaines, a 52-year-old architect, was making his way home after another exhausting day at work. His SUV glided smoothly down the road, the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. He loosened his tie, sighing as he finally neared his neighborhood. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light turned yellow. He pressed the brakes and came to a smooth stop just as it turned red. That's when he noticed the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the piercing wail of a siren. His stomach tightened. Confused but composed, he signaled and pulled over to the curb. A patrol car parked behind him, and out stepped Officer Mark Russell, a stocky man in his late 20s with a crew cut and a hardened expression. Adjusting his utility belt, Russell approached the vehicle, his presence rigid with authority. "License and registration," he commanded, his voice carrying a clipped edge. Thomas nodded, moving slowly to retrieve his paperwork. "Of course, officer." He handed them over with steady hands, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. Years of experience had taught him how to handle unnecessary scrutiny. Russell glanced at the documents but seemed more interested in studying Thomas than reading them. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "I'm not sure," Thomas replied, his tone respectful yet firm. "You didn't come to a complete stop back there," Russell stated, though there was an uncertain flicker in his voice. Thomas frowned slightly but nodded. "I believed I had, but if I was mistaken." "I understand." Russell didn't respond right away. Instead, he lingered, his gaze lingering on Thomas, as if waiting for something, some slip, some excuse. The air between them thickened as Russell shifted his stance, his fingers twitching near his holster. "You're not from around here, are you?" Russell asked, squinting at the address on the license. Thomas's jaw tensed for the briefest moment. "I've lived here for about 6 months now. My address is correct." Russell nodded slowly, but his demeanor didn't soften. The way Thomas carried himself, calm, composed, unintimidated, seemed to irritate him. His questions took on an edge, a subtle probing that hinted at something more than a traffic violation. "You in a hurry to get somewhere?" Russell pressed, leaning slightly toward the window. "No more than anyone else trying to get home after a long day." Thomas answered evenly. Russell lingered a moment longer before stepping back, seemingly dissatisfied but unable to justify prolonging the stop. Finally, he handed back the documents. "Drive safe," he muttered before walking away. Thomas took a deep breath, gripping the wheel before pulling back onto the road. As he drove off, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time he and Officer Russell crossed paths.